Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us on today's MSISAC National Webcast on prioritizing your NIST Cybersecurity Framework implementation with the CIS Critical Security Controls. I just wanted to go through a couple reminder slides, first of all, just to let you know some housekeeping items. If you are looking to connect using your computer speakers, please make sure that you're using the audio broadcast function. You'll see a small dialog box at the top left-hand corner of your screen, and please do not close this box because that will close out your audio. You can also use your telephone if you're having trouble with the computer speakers. And that brings me to the next point. If you have a question about audio or anything else, please go ahead and use the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your WebEx. We'll go ahead and try to get all of your questions answered as best we can. If you'd like to view your slides at full screen, please go ahead and use the arrows going to the right and left of the screen at the top right-hand corner, and you'll be able to view the slides at full screen. So we wanted to welcome you to today's broadcast. This webcast is a joint initiative with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the Center for Internet Security, and we would like to thank DHS for their partnership with us in this effort. I'm very pleased to say that we have more than 1,000 registrants on this exciting webcast today. As mentioned, the topic for today's MSISAC National Webcast is prioritizing your NIST Cybersecurity Framework implementation with the CIS Security Controls. There is widespread recognition about the benefits of implementing the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. As adoption grows, many organizations are looking for guidance about how they can strengthen security in phases using risk-based prioritization along with the cybersecurity framework. During this session, our speakers from the City of Portland will share their experience implementing the NIST Cybersecurity Framework in conjunction with the risk-based prioritization offered by the CIS Critical Security Controls. Our speakers have developed an in-depth planning tool for strengthening security in phases, which they will review during this webinar. All of the attendees will also be given access to the tool following this session if interested. With that being said, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our speakers today. Ted Gary is Tenable Network Security's Senior Product Marketing Manager for the Security Center Continuous View. Ted has more than 10 years of information security experience in both product management and product marketing roles. He has defined SaaS security services and file integrity management and configuration assessment products. Ted has been trained as an internal IT auditor and helped companies assess their compliance with security frameworks. Christopher Paidhrin has over 16 years of experience in information security. He is currently the Information Security Manager for the City of Portland. Christopher is also a mentor of best practices across several disciplines and models. For over 11 years, Christopher has been an award-winning information security leader. Brian has 20-plus years in information technology, ranging from systems administration to project management and information security. He is an information security architect in Portland, Oregon, and volunteers as the Director of Education for the Portland ISSA chapter. Brian holds his CISSP and GCCC as well as other industry certifications. As the Director of Education, Brian coordinates relevant local and online training opportunities. Ted, Christopher, and Brian, thank you so much for participating in today's event. I will turn things over to you now.
Thank you, Jessica. This is Ted, and I'm just going to take a minute to introduce the webcast, and I wanted to share some research that Tenable sponsored. We hired an organization called Dimensional Research, and they published a report in March. And one of the questions they ask is, what security frameworks do you plan to adopt in the following year? The #1 response was the NIST framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity, which we're going to refer to as the cybersecurity framework or even CSF today. And 14% of the respondents said they plan to adopt that in the coming year. And the second most frequent response was the CIS Critical Security Controls, or the CSC, as we'll refer to them today, and 12% were planning to adopt those. So lots of adoption for these frameworks. And the research also asked if people are using multiple frameworks, and it turns out that 44% of the organizations surveyed are. So I've talked to multiple customers and companies that are using the CSF and the CSCs together, and today Christopher and Brian are going to give us some detail about how they're using them. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Christopher and let them tell you the exciting things they're doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Ted and Jessica. Welcome, everyone. And thank you for giving us your time, attention, and the opportunity to share Portland, Oregon's adaptation of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. I'd like to begin by setting expectations in context. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework is a living framework, and the city's customized use is but one example. Our implementation will show you how adaptable the framework can be, how the critical security controls can overlay to provide a concise, prioritized set of external risk practices, and how the framework can serve as a valuable tool for effectively communicating cybersecurity risk to all audiences. That would be internal, external, organizational customers, and leadership. So for the past 16 years, I've been working with various security frameworks. There are more than 200 out there. Most are too costly and too complex to implement and sustain, and the majority of them are wholly controls-centric, good for technology and security audiences, but not so good for organizational customers, leadership, or anyone else. In 2013, when the draft of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework was introduced, I saw its potential. Here was a free, information lifecycle arranged, risk-aligned, standards-based context that could easily accommodate my mandate to align cybersecurity risk with organizational risk, business-driven priorities with technology services, and information security program maturity with metrics and projects all in one visual context. Here's a snapshot of that adaptation, and I'm going to quickly walk you through the expanded elements and then ask Brian to walk you through the top 5 critical security controls. Tenable has provided you with a link of our template at the end of the slide presentation. It's free for your use and exploration. Our hope is that you'll leverage the ideas it offers to fit your purposes. To begin, the framework core is represented with only slight relabeling of the subcategories to reflect our functional services. The underlying controls and references are not changed. In Portland's case, we made bold those elements we offer our customers, what IT Service Management calls a service catalog. We incorporate prioritized risks, internal and external. For internally assessed risks, we use the free Audit Scripts Critical Security Control Aligned Assessment Tool, but you can use any tool like Department of Homeland Security's Cyber Resilience Review, CRR. The external prioritized risks are represented by the Center for Internet Security's Critical Security Controls, which have been aligned to the framework subcategories. And this comparison between external and external can be instructive and drive organizational priorities. Readily, an organization can compare specific risks and identify best practice remediations. Mapping a multi-year budget to the framework helps to align investments with risks. In our case, red are requested but unfunded initiatives, green funded budget requests, and black figures proposed funding. As risks are identified, prioritized, mitigated, or left unattended, year over year, a context is provided for return on investment. And although the framework purposefully does not include a service or functional maturity model, aside from the tiers, I find a fully aligned maturity matrix extremely effective at translating information security risks and service maturity to non-technical audiences. And we use a color-coded maturity model. And you can use any maturity model that you already have or prefer. It's not mandatory. Here, the dark gray is for current state. Orange for challenge areas where vulnerabilities have been identified and capabilities are weak. Green to demonstrate progress directly associated with both funding and risk priorities. And finally, a light gray for the future target state. And here it's just represented as a mid-ranged or a managed risk level for near-term goals, where the organization can afford the capabilities and the controls and can assume the associated risks. Finally, a roadmap of remediation, programs, projects, initiatives, technologies, new services, assessments, audits, progress report strategy, whatever is relevant to your program, all and any can be mapped and easily monitored for progress and resource planning quarter by quarter for as many years as your program map goes out. Culminating in a one-page common frame of reference for all audiences. It may be a legal sheet or even a ledger-sized for ease of reading, but a consistent visual context for all audiences. If your audience does not need to see the funding, you can hide the budget columns, but the context of the visual representation remains for the board, for leadership, for risk management, project teams, the same representation. And there's no need to translate between the risks, priorities, maturity states, and challenges. It can be understood with a slight preparation and a studied glance. Highlight a column or row for any given conversation, depending on your audience. Now, over the past 3 years, in healthcare and municipal organizations, this adaptation has proven very effective at aligning cybersecurity risk with organizational risk, funding for identified vulnerabilities and maturity challenges, and a risk remediation roadmap aligned to organizational priorities. And we hope that this adaptation stimulates ideas for you to explore how the framework can serve to add lasting value for your organizations. Thank you. And I'd like to hand it over to Brian Ventura to walk you through the top 5 critical security controls, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Christopher. So the critical security controls are our technical controls. You saw how we mapped them into the cybersecurity framework, and we've then taken those. I got my 2. Okay, and so overall our critical security controls are giving us a prioritization for our technical side, and the reason for that is the critical security controls are a prioritized list of controls based on the current breaches that the breaches that have happened in the past and the breaches that are expected in the future, and finding controls that would mitigate those risks directly. One other thing I wanted to mention on the critical security controls overall is the top 5 controls. There's some research that's been put out, specifically by the Australian Signals Directorate, that what we're calling our top 5 controls in the critical security controls would have mitigated more than 85% of the breaches that have happened up until this date. And that's why we find it important as a baseline risk assessment to start with the critical security controls. So going through just the first 5 controls and just doing a quick brushstroke on them, there are controls have a lot more detail, so I encourage you to read through that detail, but I'm going to go over what kind of 3 different tiers of maturity to talk about each control, just to give you a flavor of how you can apply these controls. There's much more information, as I said, in the controls themselves, and we'll give a spreadsheet at the end that will help in assessing your level of maturity so that you can see where you need to work on with these controls. So the first control is inventory of authorized and unauthorized devices. At the low level, we're talking about an inventory that may be on paper, maybe in Excel, maybe in a tool that might even have agents running on your devices that are pulling this information. We're asking you to come up with an inventory, track those assets, and authorize them to be on your network, and the machines and devices that are not authorized should be removed from the network. And one of the things that's kind of a hard part for many organizations is talking about the other devices that are not workstations and servers. So workstations and servers, there's often tools and agents and lots of robust inventory systems, but what about the smart TVs, the voice over IP phones, the security cameras? What else do you have on your network that might fit into, it has access to the network, so it should be inventoried and we should have control over whether it gets on our network. And that becomes a little more challenging. In our inventory, we highly recommend that you start tracking where the assets go in your organization. So these assets are owned by this person or this department. At the city, they're bureaus, so I may say bureaus. For you, you may just think of those as departments. But that's useful information to track. Moving up to the medium level of control, of this control, we're going to want to automate our inventory system, and there's 2 aspects to that. One would be active and passive scanning for new devices, and I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide, but then also implementing a network access control or network level access. There are 2 different terms for authorizing your devices before they join the network. And there's solutions for that, and that's what this control is asking to do, is have that NAC solution, network access control solution, that's going to authorize your devices, and if a device is not authorized, you're either going to disallow them from connecting or you're going to push them off to a network that might just only have internet access and doesn't have access to internal resources. How you deal with that is open for interpretation. The high level of the control is reporting back your risk to the organization, specifically to those departments and bureaus, so that they can determine what their risk levels are, and they can partner with you to come up with technical controls around risk. If we can report on the number of unauthorized devices on our network that are associated with the accounting department, they may be able to make a risk-based decision on that information. So here are some sample dashboards from the Tenable Nessus Security Center product, and this is an example to show you what kind of information you could get. Specifically here, I'm zooming in on the main graphic there, and here we're seeing the number of increased hosts on the network over time. The idea with this kind of information is this can feed back to our either an incident where we just determine what we need to do about this new device. Do we need to provision it and authorize it for the network, or do we need to deauthorize it? Can we report back risk based on specific departments on how many new devices they have and what they can do about those devices? This is another view of it, specifically talking about MAC addresses, wireless devices. What are you doing with mobile and bring your own device? Those are all challenges that we need to address in this control, and the Tenable tools and others can help us to find those new devices and manage them. Our second control is very similar to our first control. It's inventory of authorized and unauthorized software. So we've moved from our hardware to our software. The idea here is the hardware is the basis that we're going to apply all future controls, and now we're looking at a control of how are we going to manage the software that's running on these devices. The low level of this one is we want an inventory. I envision that the inventory tool would be the same tool that you use for the physical inventory of devices, and that tool could be very useful to also inventory all of the software. The second level of this is we're going to use something to manage what software is allowed to run and unauthorized to run on the systems, and we may be, the best solution for this is a software whitelisting type solution. The good news with software whitelisting is it is built into the Microsoft operating systems and many of our other security tools. We may be able to find a solution that would do software whitelisting, but there we would authorize a list of software and allow that to run from our inventory, and we would disallow rogue software, unexpected software from running. The goal is basically to stop malicious software from running. So if someone comes to you with a new request, let me give an example. If you're a Microsoft Office shop, you would allow all the Microsoft Office products, but you may disallow OpenOffice. However, if a business unit comes to you and says they want to use OpenOffice, they have a business use case, you can make a risk assessment and then authorize that software. So we're not saying disallow all software, we're just saying be smart about what software is on the allowed list. And then the third level of, the highest level of control over this is we're going to report back risk on where we might not be able to run software whitelisting, where we may not be able to apply this control, where we may not have inventories. Good example of that would be those printers, those smart devices that are on the network, and maybe even Unix operating systems or other operating systems where there aren't as powerful of tools. That might be where we would have to report risk, but if we report that risk back to business units, then they can make risk-based decisions for themselves. Some examples of our tools. Tenable has this as the critical security controls software pane, and they're giving us views into what software was found through the scans on different devices. Here we see in the bottom unsupported products either on the Windows platform or application layer. We can get some of that information. Again, these pieces of information would feed back into our inventory, help us to determine whether we need to authorize that software or if we need to have a conversation with someone on why they can't have that software or need to remove the software. On our third control, this is secure configurations for hardware and software on mobile devices, laptops, workstations, and servers. We're looking at, now that we know all the software and all the hardware that we have in our environment, how do we make sure that we're doing the best with the different settings in a security sense for our organization? Many of our pieces of software operating systems have hundreds and thousands of settings that can be applied to the software. Hundreds of those may even be security related. How are we applying those? There's a lot of resources out there, so at our lowest level, we're downloading some kind of report or tool from different, either our vendors or the Center for Internet Security does have really good benchmarks. We would download those tools and we would evaluate our software against those tools and authorize or deauthorize the security settings and have justifications for why we're not doing specific security settings for each of the pieces of software. When thinking about the types of software that we have, there's many pieces of software that will have lots of settings, the operating systems, the web browsers, and there's other software that might have very few settings. Think of something like 7-zip or WinZip may not have a lot of security settings to it, but we want to balance that and do a review of each of those pieces of software and ensure that we're applying the security levels appropriate to that software. Then on our medium level, our mid-level, we're going to use automated tools to help to manage these settings. So in a Microsoft world, we have Active Directory group policy that can apply these settings, so that's very useful. On the Unix side, there's companies that do have solutions, including Puppet Labs has a really good solution for applying secure configurations. Identifying and finding what tools you need to apply these so that you can make sure that they're automated, that the settings are not getting changed outside of your knowledge, and that you're reporting on those changes is very important. So that's your medium level. Tenable scanners and other products like that can take in what's called SCAP files, which is a method for documenting all of the security settings. You can import those into your scanners, and it can scan your systems to determine whether those settings are on or off. So another example of our automation. And then, of course, from the scans, from Active Directory or wherever we're applying these, we can get information about how well we're doing against those configurations, and we can report that back to our business units. So that's our higher level of actually reporting our levels. Here's an example of the Tenable dashboards for secure configurations. Most of the buttons that we see, the purples and such, are clickable. We can dig into each of those areas and find out robust information about which settings and where we're seeing problems with deviations from our secure configuration authorized secure configuration. So those can be very useful. In each of these, when we do drill down, I wanted to just show really quickly, this may be hard to read on your screen, but it's showing some kind of measures of how we're doing in this control. So you have a percentage of systems that are within compliance, that have been scanned in a certain amount of time, how many are in compliance. You get these percentages, you can click in and find out where you have deviations from what you expect or what you're implementing, and this is where you can get that information that you can report back to the business unit on risk. Our fourth control is our vulnerability assessment, and this is specifically talking about where there are known vulnerabilities or flaws in the software or hardware that we have in our environment. Tenable works really well in this environment because this is their core of their project, is to have the scanning for vulnerabilities. We want to make sure that we have tools to do vulnerability assessments and manage our vulnerabilities over time. So our lowest level is we want to make sure that we're scanning for vulnerabilities, we're finding out about vulnerabilities. We all know about Patch Tuesday from Microsoft. Many of the other vendors have latched onto that Patch Tuesday and release patches. We want to find those vulnerabilities, and then we want to remediate them. So we want to patch, we want to apply whatever settings are appropriate from our vendors. In the medium range of this, we're going to get from vulnerability assessments to vulnerability management, where we're actually making educated decisions on how critical a specific vulnerability is to our organization and whether it needs to be applied faster or slower than what the general report says. Examples that I have of that are Heartbleed was a major, huge problem for many organizations a while back, and that was all hands on deck and fix it. So everybody scrambled and did really good work with that. However, if you were only a Microsoft IIS site, you would have no exposure to the vulnerability, and Heartbleed could pass you by. If you could identify that your organization does not use any products that are susceptible to Heartbleed, then you would downgrade that vulnerability and say, we're going to scan for it, but it's not a high priority because we don't have that exposure. Another example from this month is that Microsoft DNS server has a critical vulnerability that allows you to run remote code on your DNS servers. And at first blush, that sounds like problematic, something we want to fix. but then when we do an internal assessment of that, we may find that our DNS servers are running on our domain controllers, and that raises the risk much higher and causes it to be something we might want to address even faster than the standard. It was just one of the patches, and we're going to patch it within this patch cycle. So those are some examples of how we would start managing vulnerabilities versus just reporting on them and then patching against them. And then, of course, on our highest level, we do want to report whatever vulnerabilities we find. It's often the case that some of our applications, especially our more complex applications, can't patch in a normal cycle. So we have to have management of how those vulnerabilities are being managed over time, and then how we're responding to risk, whether we need mitigations around that. We need the business unit to talk to us about that and make a risk-based decision on those vulnerabilities. So Tenable has some really good dashboards for this, and we can see how we're managing vulnerabilities since here it's early May. We started scanning. We noticed that we have a number of criticals and a number of mediums, and they're changing over time, so that think of those as maybe during our patch cycles they come down, but then new patches come out in the next cycle. How are we managing that, and how are we reporting that? Do we have different methods for patching or remediating these for criticals, highs, and mediums, and how do we apply that in our organization? Another view of it, and here we can see the different types of systems that are having vulnerabilities, where we can click through and find robust information about those specific areas that might be useful in our remediation. Our fifth control, the last one I'll go over, is controlled use of administrative privileges. This is an issue that's been in the forefront for a number of years, and with many organizations, the switch from Windows XP to Windows 7 allowed organizations to really start controlling the administrative access, and we're asking to take it to another level. So when thinking about your systems, do your users have access to install software on their workstation? That's something that we want to remove that privilege on those workstations. Same thing within our applications. Do they have administrative privilege within our core applications? And if so, we want to remove that access from their normal accounts. A common way to address this is the user has a normal user account that they can read email, and they can surf the internet, and they can do normal business related work. And then when the person needs administrative privilege, maybe they're actually a server administrator or a database administrator, or maybe they just have the administrative privilege in their application, we want to give them a separate account that is their administrative account, and that account has access to run those administrative privileges where the normal account does not. Further, we want to limit the use of that administrative account such that the user is not logging in normally, they're not surfing the net, they're not using email, and we want to make sure that you probably want policies that say that those administrative accounts cannot be used for those purposes, because that's the common vector for attacks and software gaining additional privileges. So those are the kinds of controls we're talking about with this. It extends to our domain admins and our root level accounts on our servers. I listened to an interesting podcast from one of the Microsoft masters of Active Directory, and the question was asked, how many domain admins should we have in our environment? And I had an expected answer, and the question was further expanded to, well, what if I only have 5 IT people, or our organization has 100 IT people, or our organization has 500,000 employees, and therefore our IT force is very large? And the surprising answer came back from this person that knows Active Directory that we should have 0 people in the domain admin group, because there are other ways of doing that function. And that really surprised me. And that's the kind of evaluation we need to do of all of our administrative access, and find the ways that we can remove people from those privileged areas so that they are only running normal functions. And I leave it to you to find out how to get rid of domain admins, but it was very interesting to listen to, and it's something that I've brought back to the city and we've had conversations about, but that's an example of where we remove those administrative level access. And then on the high level, the medium level and the high level, we want to monitor these accounts. We want, whenever there is an administrative account, we want to monitor how people are using it, what they're doing with it, and report back on that. And we want to report back how many administrative accounts we have per business unit, because that's additional risk that business units may be taking on because they need to work fast or they need to have their experts be able to manipulate data, and we just need to report back the risk that is being incurred by having those administrative level accounts. So some dashboards that talk about administrative use, and specifically we grade out the users, but we're seeing how many times those administrative accounts have been used over time, and we can decide whether that's appropriate or inappropriate, and we can report that back to our organization. So the critical security controls, there are 20 of them, so we only went over the first 5, and there's a lot more to these. A tool that we've used, and it's a tool that was produced by one of the SANS instructors that is the primary editor for the critical security controls themselves with the Center for Internet Security, as well as he's the maintainer of the SANS material for teaching the critical security controls. When teaching, we use this tool to show how you can audit against your critical security controls to determine what your maturity is today. And there's a link in the end of this, in the next slide, that will allow you to download this spreadsheet. This is another tool that you can use to measure your current maturity in each of the critical security controls by answering simple questions like, do I have a policy? Is it written down? Am I applying the control? Am I automating the control? And am I reporting on the control? So there's different answers that you can give to that, which wraps up into this dashboard view that gives you an overall maturity rating and then gives you some breakdowns. The bottom is all the different 20 controls. The upper right is showing you policies complete. How well are you doing with that? How well are you doing with the first 5 controls, all controls, and then automation and reporting. And it's a really good tool. We use it internally at the city to help us to find our current maturity, and it's a good tool to use for your first couple of years, perhaps, in applying the critical security controls, but there'll be a time when you want to make sure that this is fully automated and you have some GRC platform that's going to go ahead and map this for you real time or close to real time. And that's what I have on the critical security controls, and I welcome lots of questions on both the critical security controls and the cybersecurity framework. These are the links and resources that we talked about today. There's the Center for Internet Security itself, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, the critical security controls themselves. Then the audit scripts resource is that resource that I talked about, the previous slide's spreadsheet, and James Taralla is the main editor for the critical security controls and the SANS material. And last, the CSF planning spreadsheet is the spreadsheet that Christopher was talking about and had built, and it has both examples in it as well as a clean sheet for you to work on for yourself. And I think we're ready at this point for questions. Jessica?
Yes, thank you so much to Ted, Christopher, and Brian. I just wanted to mention first, before we get into the questions, the webcast recording for this event will be on the website, the MSISAC website, early to mid next week. So if you are looking for the recording or the slides, feel free to look that way or send us an email after the webcast, and we'll let you know. So the first question, and I'm going to go through as much as I can here. We do have quite a few. The first one that I have on the list is, I appreciated Brian's use of the controls to form a risk matrix. Can you be a little bit more specific about how you related the controls to each area of risk? That might be kind of a broad question.
Okay. In the cybersecurity framework document that Christopher built, we've added a column that is the critical security controls column, and then there's a mapping document that the critical security controls group has managed over time, SANS mainly, and they map the critical security controls to a large number of other control frameworks. One of them being the cybersecurity framework. From that work, we've mapped it back the other way so that we have the cybersecurity framework as our main framework, and then the column for the the critical security controls has the control numbers that are associated with that NIST cybersecurity framework function or area. Hopefully that answers the question.
Sure, and if anyone needs, follow-up questions, feel free to email us and we'll get those handled. So the next two questions came kind of at the beginning of the webcast, so they might be for Christopher. The first one is, how is BYOD being handled for inventory?
Within the city, we're not yet embracing BYOD because we are just evolving our enterprise mobility management platform, and we have several pilots out with fire and police and our parks and recreations bureaus, but we are in the early stages of enterprise mobility management. So we're not yet, our policy is scheduled and planned for incorporating BYOD, bring your own device, but we haven't implemented it yet.
And as far as the critical security controls, they do have an answer for that question, and the answer is BYOD or not BYOD. We have 20 control families. Let's apply those controls to all the devices, which means that in a BYOD environment, how are we getting an inventory? How are we getting the software whitelisting? How are we managing our vulnerabilities and our secure configurations? If we can meet all those controls, then we have no problem with people bringing in their mobile devices, their laptops, whatever, but that probably means that we need to install an agent that we manage in our office, and some organizations, the individuals will say, well, I don't want your agent on my device. So that is a challenge, but the critical security controls are saying we still need to apply these controls because the risk is still there and we need to mitigate it.
Great, thank you so much. The next one is also toward the beginning of the event. Is it assumed that clients are not local admins?
So for the critical security controls on the workstations, yes, and I would even extend that to when people log into advanced systems, they should have, so their application layer or even the servers, they should have a normal user where they're doing normal work, and then they should log in separately to do their advanced work in those systems. And that means that in a Microsoft world, you would be doing a run as to run the management tool as an administrator, and in the Unix world, that's the same command is called sudo for becoming another user for running a specific command, and you would only run the commands you need to run as administrators in that administrative account, and all other functions would be run in the normal user account.
Okay, great, thank you so much. The next question, what is the difference between NIST CSF and SP 800-53?
The 800-53 is the larger contextual framework for risk management. The cybersecurity control framework is a contextualization of it. It is intended to take the primary, but not the only NIST standard and presentation and put it into the context of the life cycle of information. So the whole framing of it is, how do you identify, how do you protect, how do you, and you move, you chunk or categorize the 853 into actionable and logical flow of information. So think of it in terms of the life cycle of information. If you look at the NIST Cybersecurity framework, the top half, pretty much, is governance, risk, compliance. The lower half is predominantly operational. So it provides a truly, to use the word, a framework for looking at the controls.
Great, thank you. The next question, can the critical security controls top 5 to 20 baseline be used to start a risk assessment for an organization going forward without reinventing the wheel?
That is definitely the goal of the critical security controls with that assessment document, or any other way to look at it is, this is a starting point. Let's see what tools we already have and let's leverage those. Let's see what our maturity is with each of the different critical security controls with our current tools, and then find what those same tools could do to leverage us to increase that maturity to the next level.
Great. And I'm just kind of looking through here. This is a great question. What was your greatest challenge in getting your program going? Was it budgetary, policy, culture, scheduling, et cetera?
None of the above. Funding. The program itself was readily adopted. As Ted had mentioned earlier, the widespread adoption of the framework provides leadership the context for, this is a nationally and internationally recognized framework. There is migration toward it. It is much simpler to implement and maintain than, let's say, an international standards organization, and more tactically applicable than maybe a management framework. And it provides that really good soft spot between qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. So the adoption really comes down to, now that you've identified the risks, you've identified our vulnerabilities, you've come with a greatly appreciated remediation plan, roadmapped it out quarter by quarter, where they can then say, did you start on time? Are you working with this? Are you applying the funds correctly? The leadership can use it as a body of metrics. You'll see in this slide that you can choose where you have internal, meaning to your technology group, and external metrics. So you would probably not want to have more than 3 to 5 external metrics for leadership and public consumption, but you can have any number of internal metrics that help drive your initiatives.
That actually leads into really nicely into kind of a similar question in regards to how has the business embraced this security work? So the next part of that question is, as you deploy the frameworks, is the ability for the business to operate as they need a priority in your planning deployment, and have you been able to get full participation from your elected officials? I think that kind of ties in nicely with what you were just saying.
We have, and we do, and the heart of any service, including information security, is to add to or to add beneficiary value to the business at hand. So the business drives the risk appetite, and the business drives the priorities. This just provides a context for here, our specialty is to identify and mitigate risks. When we communicate that to the business lines or the elected officials, they're looking for, are we putting enough money in the right places, and are you demonstrating return on risk or return on investment? And as we do that over the years, it reinforces for them the value of the program. And we have full buy-in from leadership, from the electeds, from the bureaus that we share this with.
That's great. So this kind of relates also, and I'm not sure, how much you would want to divulge, but the next question kind of relates similarly in terms of cost. How much did the City of Portland roughly spend to implement this framework?
To implement the framework itself doesn't cost anything, and I've been sharing this freely, this overlay to the NIST Critical Security Framework for years now, give it away free all the time. The implementation of your controls would be unique to your organization and your appetite for risk. So that's the real cost. I can share with you that in my previous experience, it took us maybe a couple of years to get $500,000 worth of security investments. With the implementation of this model, this framework, we moved that to $500,000 a year, and in 1 year, $2 million. The power of this to convey to the decision makers, to financial authority, and to leadership is that it brings into context what is otherwise an abstract headlines of the news, risk alert, to here's a quantifiable metric, there's a quantifiable plan, and we may not be perfect, we may still have lots of attacks, but at least we have a systematized, methodical, and national standards aligned program that gets us from where we've identified where we are today to a reasonable, affordable, managed level of a security program.
And just to add to that, the framework and the critical security controls for us and for any organization should be there to allow you to report risk and have solutions to mitigate the risk in the future, but the goal is not to get all these controls in place immediately. It's to report that we're missing these controls, we're lacking in this area, and we recommend that we make a decision. And that's why it's easy to implement the framework, and then it's a maturity to move through the maturity. It is what takes those roadblocks of funding and other things. But this tool allows us to report that and show why we want to do it and the value for moving forward. Last, on the critical security controls on the Audit Scripts website, at the bottom of those free resources, there is a how to implement the critical security controls on a shoestring budget. It's a gold paper by someone who went through the SANS program. It might be useful if you find that you have no budget.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try to get to 2 more questions here before we end. I know we started a couple minutes late. So the next question is a little broad. So in your opinion, how does the COBIT 5 framework compare?
It does align. If one looks into the resources, not shown here in this representation, but it's there in the background, COBIT is fully mapped to the cybersecurity framework. For certain organizations where they've adopted that model and framework, it's completely appropriate. I've used it in the past. At the city, I don't have the audience that needs to see it from a management and a process and a service flow perspective, so you could overlay it as we have here, the CSC Top 20. It's just not asked for, therefore we don't add that administrative overhead.
And the mapping document is in one of the links that we sent to you. So there is a mapping document from the critical security controls to all kinds of different frameworks, including COBIT and many others.
Great, thank you. And for the last question, it's about vulnerability scanners. So are vulnerability scanners intended to be on systems connected to the internet? How would these scanners work on a system that does not have internet access?
The scanner needs to get a feed of the latest vulnerabilities, so you have the challenge of getting that feed somehow. Most of your vendors, including Tenable, are going to provide you that feed as long as you're paying for their service, so you need to get that feed somehow onto the box. Once you have the feed on the scanner doesn't need to go to the internet while it's performing a scan, and we do have areas where we do take, we have laptops that have scanners that we can walk around and do that. So we were able to do that offline scanning with our systems, and then we just get the feeds onto that machine prior to doing the scan. There are solutions for cloud-based scanning, and there are advantages to scanning from the outside as well as the inside, and so there's a lot of detail in that vulnerability scanning, and you'll see lots of that in the critical security controls.
Great, thank you so much. It is now 3 o'clock Eastern, so I wanted to wrap everything up. Thank you to Ted, Christopher, and Brian for an excellent and informative session. Just a reminder for the folks who are on, the next MSISAC National Webcast is scheduled for August of 2016, so please stay tuned to hear from us for more additional information on this event. As mentioned before, this webcast information will be available, the webcast recording will be available at msisac.cisecurity.org, so please feel free to visit that early to mid next week. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at info@msisac.org, and we will try to get back to you as soon as possible. And thank you so much again for joining us today. We appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.